Yeah, and I think this kind of gets into something I noticed in looking at your website is you talk a lot about the tone of voice.
Mhm.
And so I would love for you to speak for a little bit about that because as much as we want to be ourselves when we're branding our companies, like, the fact is I talk differently to my kids than I do to my wife, than I do to a potential client. And so there is some tone of voice and like words I choose to use and not use. I'm just curious about your perspective because I know you do a lot of work in this area with companies. Just explaining like what tone of voice is and how to approach it as a company.
Yeah, so basically tone of voice is it's kind of like the equivalent of the verbal equivalent of your visual aspects. So all your logos, your type, your colors, typography, all that. So your tone of voice is the verbal aspect of that. It's how what you say, kind of the grammar you use, your main topics that you're going to be talking about over and over again. It's about how you're coming across basically and making sure that that is consistent. So, for example, in the tone of voice guides that I do, we set out the goals for the business, their mission, what they're ultimately trying to do, what they want to do in the future, how they want to come across. So, for example, we talked about those kind of personality traits. So, are they a positive person? Are they sarcastic? Are they, all these different types of things and have a list of those. And what I do is create a framework. So it's like a practical framework or a checklist that when they're writing content, they can go through it and say, okay, am I speaking this way? Am I doing this? Am I speaking in a positive tone of voice? Have I framed it a certain way? And so that will help them to do it consistently. And that's just really important because you are building a personality. You want to come across as someone people remember, that they trust, like all those things we talked about. And so otherwise you're going to blend in with people. For example, I have a client who's an environmental consultancy. And when I was creating their tone of voice and I looked at competitors, a lot of competitors, spoke quite sophisticated. They were quite formal. They were quite cold. There was no real personality. And so that was an opportunity for my clients to be a bit more personable, be more friendly, a bit more down to earth, explain maybe more complicated terms and that kind of thing. So they could set themselves apart from all the other agencies out there. And so that's kind of why it's important as well.
Yeah, I like that idea of setting yourself apart by like not using jargon. Again, as you know, since we're both writers, like that's something that I like crusade against is don't
Yeah.
keep jargon for your staff meetings, or just better yet, don't use it at all.